Well, welcome everyone to the Resilient Leadership Podcast, where everything we talk about is aimed at helping you lead with a greater sense of calm, clarity, and conviction, even in these anxious times. And my name is Irvine Nugent, and I'm joined as always by my friend and co-collaborator, Bridget Tyre. Bridget, how are you doing today?
Well, thank you for asking, Irvine. I'm doing great. As we record this episode, it is September. It is gorgeous, crisp, clear, blue skies, lower humidity. What's not to love, right?
Oh,
So I got a little pessimistic step and eager to dive into this very interesting conversation that you've teed up for us to have around sadness and its implications for the workplace and for leadership, which I think if you tried to Google how many people or podcasts are talking about it, you wouldn't get a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks. Yeah. So today's episode we're calling The Gift of Sadness, Giving Time for the Inner Work. And I chose that wording very deliberately because we certainly do not think of sadness as a gift. We think it as something that's a burden that we have to bear or get over. And what I'm inviting everyone today is to really think about the messages they've received about sadness, to think about that. And so often it's considered a negative emotion. And even culturally, that we've these things, real men don't cry or something. There's a whole cultural thing about sadness in men. For our male listeners, think about that. Think about the messages you've received about sadness. And where this episode came from is that over the past couple of months, I have had 3 clients who have been really struggling and dealing with sadness in their lives and in the workplace. And as I listened to them in the coaching conversations, some of the things that I've heard them say was, I'm really surprised at how intense this feeling is and this experience. And another, just when I think I'm over it, it comes right back again. Or, I remember one catch them said, I just stupid, but I just don't know how to get over it. And so I'm thinking about, wow, these are real experiences happening to people in the workplace, to leaders. And so often we don't have an avenue to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And yet it's such a common experience. So I thought it'd be great today just to explore sadness and how all the variations that comes up in the workplace, maybe surprisingly that we're not really expecting it. And then also, maybe you're not going through sadness, but let me tell you this, there's someone in your team, there's someone in the office who is. And so very often I think we struggle with, how do we deal with that? Like, what do I say? What do I not say, et cetera? People are, a little confused of that. So I think, Bridget, as we begin this, I'm curious, as you reflect upon this, what were some of the messages about sadness that you grew up with?
It's such an interesting question, and I haven't thought about that till you asked it. And I would guess that maybe the principal message I grew up with is buck it up. You just don't dwell in sadness or any other kind of yucky emotion. You just sort of buck it up and move on. And it makes sense because my mom was very, she left her home when she was 16 to make her way in the world. And she was a entrepreneur and a working woman at a time when nobody was. And she had 4 kids and she had to buck it up every day,
Yeah.
I don't think I ever heard anything directly. What I'm really sort of noticing is the message was implicit, not explicit.
Yeah.
And consequently, I think it took me a long time to be okay with sadness.
Yeah.
Yeah. How about you?
As I think about my childhood and growing up as well, I think I have a little dualism going on. So in the one sense, and people know my history of growing up in conflict, there was the same as you, get over it, that be resilient and bad things happen and they're happening every day. And this is part of life. And there is the blessing, I'm going to say this, the blessing of growing up Irish with an Irish wake, which is, it actually was one of the shocking cultural things that when I came to the US, and there was the difference in how death was dealt with. And an Arlenig was something that was out there. It is, you can't avoid it. There, you're in the house. There is emotional people around, etc. And yet I came here and I felt, wow, this is a bit too nice and tidy and neat. And where is this? So I think part of that was, so there was this on one hand, it was saying get over it. But on the other hand, there was a moment where it was fine just to let it all out. And it was all part of that process, which
Yeah.
I think helped me in many ways see that this was more complex. Rather, it wasn't just as
Hmm.
simple as that. There was more that was going on.
Fascinating. And actually listening to your story about the lived experience of death, right? And then
Yes.
letting it all out jogged a memory for me.
Mm,
Oh my goodness. So I lost both my parents pretty early when my father died. So my mother died when I was 15 or 16, and my father died when I was 21. It's pretty devastating. I have a wonderful older brother who really stepped in and kept
mm,
the siblings together. But at the funeral, at my dad's funeral, I was sobbing. And
mm.
my brother turned to me and said, BB, because that was my nickname, BB, get it together.
Yeah.
I've forgotten that. Like, I'd
Yeah.
totally forgotten that until you said that, because I was letting it all out, as you were saying.
Yeah.
And that apparently made, him uncomfortable, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So isn't it interesting how
Yeah.
we have these messages and like sometimes we don't even know that there's still a memory. Like that's still a memory, but I didn't know it till you talked about yours.
Yeah. Wow.
So
Fascinating.
yeah. So I know you like to often ground our conversations in neuroscience. So do I. And I am definitely curious about the brain and sadness and what does the science tell us about this? What would you like to share about that, Irvin?
Yeah, as I think about this, there's two things I think I'd be curious in exploring a little bit. One is why evolve with sadness? Like what purpose does sadness have? And then I'm curious about what's going on in the brain. So let me maybe pick that first one. And it is really interesting because, I think we've mentioned before that there's no use in calling emotions good or bad, or I think it's much better to really, what's the message here? Why have sadness? And I think we've mentioned before that Paul Ekman, who was one of the great thinkers, the early thinkers around emotions, said, emotions are a process to help us deal with matters important to our welfare without thinking. So, same way, sadness helps our welfare. And it's wondering, well, what is it? What's going on there? And when you think about it, sadness is about loss. That's really the trigger for it. And that loss can be a person, of course, it can be a pet, or, as we'll get into a little bit, there's all kinds of loss in our lives that are happening in the workplace that don't necessarily need to be the death of a person, but it's impacting us. And when you think about it from an evolutionary point of view, evolution is all about helping us survive. And so when you think about when we lose a seminal person in our lives, what happens is that we're drawn inside. And of course, a lot of that is that we focus in kind of reflecting about that experience and about the meaning of that experience. And so we go into this pessimistic, socially drawn, and we really don't have an appetite for new relationships. And so when you think about when it comes to survival, that's a very dangerous moment
Hmm.
because we have to be surrounded at that stage for our own protection. And
Right.
one of the things we've actually mentioned before is like facial feedback. Whenever you see a sad person, oh boy, what happens is you become sad yourself. And so when you think about the genius of our emotions in this very vulnerable time, people have compassion for you and protect you and invite you into the group in a moment where you could have actually been left alone. And that would not have
Mm.
been the best. So I think, when we think about evolutionary psychologists, think that this is really where sadness is. It is giving us the protection of the group so that we can go through this experience, often which is an inner experience and time to process what's happened, which I think is so beautiful.
Wow, that is very interesting.
Yeah.
And you say there's a moment of danger where if our sadness is not noticed and received by the community around us, we can become further isolated.
Yes, absolutely.
And yet, I think what you're also saying is the emotion of sadness tells us about what matters to us in loss, but it's also part of the glue that holds us together, or it's supposed to be.
Yeah. And this opportunity, I think, to grow and develop. Yeah. So if that's what's happening in an evolutionary context, I'd be curious, Bridget, kind of what insights might we have of what's happening in the brain whenever we go through an experience of sadness?
You mentioned as sadness settles in, a person can become withdrawn and pessimistic. That's a moment in time where hopefully, as we were just saying, the group surrounds us. But there's actually been a fair amount of research about what is happening in the brain when we experience that sense of isolation, pessimism, withdrawal. And I think the research has in part been fueled by the rise of clinical depression. One
Mm,
in 10 people have clinical depression. Now, we're not talking about that. We're talking about sadness. And the difference is clinical depression has a lasting quality to it. And it's accompanied by feelings of hopelessness and apathy, right?
mm,
Whereas sadness, it can settle in for a while, but it does eventually soften
yeah.
and it does eventually resolve, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
What the research tells us about what's going on in the brain is kind of interesting. So, the journal Cell published a study from a group of researchers who listened in on the electrical conversations in the brain. In other words, the signals that the brain regions are sending to one another,
Yeah.
like overhearing a conversation, right? Private
Love
conversation.
it. Love it.
And when a person's feeling sad, they found that communication actually increases between brain cells in two specific regions of the brain involved in memory and emotion.
Mm, mm,
So that's kind of interesting. Think about that your emotional regions or cells associated with that and memory are chit chatting more. It's unclear exactly how they intermingle, but the researchers speculate that when a person is feeling down, the amygdala triggers the recollection of sad memories
yeah.
and vice versa.
Yeah.
Kind of interesting, right?
I love that. Yeah. Yeah. And it makes total sense, kind of how much, I mean, just in the beginning of this episode, kind of, our conversation triggered a memory of a funeral for you, which was there. It's in there, and so often I think we forget, kind of that memory storage we have and how that dialogues. Yeah. Powerful.
So we know there's some kind of link here between memories and emotion and so forth. So with all that in mind, Irvin, what let's talk about because you stated this at the beginning that sadness is a gift to us as human
Mm.
beings. So let's delve into that. What's
Yeah.
the message in the gift?
Yeah. So, it's interesting, sadness itself covers a multitude of different experiences, and there's a range in the feelings that come with that. So, it can, at times we have to experience disappointment in life, or we're a little bit discouraged, but then it goes right through to kind of, we can be distraught and anguish and grief, this rawness as well, which we go through. So there's this whole range of experiences. But, I mentioned before that the universal trigger is loss. And that loss, quite obviously, the thing we think about is the death of a loved one. But when you think about, there are other losses in life that at times I don't think we necessarily use the word loss when we first hear it. So like a loss of a relationship, either from divorce or breakup, a health crisis, is another loss. Here we go from functioning in one way, health crisis comes, and all of a sudden we have to reevaluate something. The loss in the workplace of a promotion. I'm
Mm,
dealing with a candidate or a client at the moment who put their name forward, was very hopeful, very confident, and they didn't even get a call back. And the sense of loss there, about that, the loss of a job. As companies kind of, we go through, if you've been let go or whatever, failure or rejection. And sometimes we interpret that maybe the loss of feeling you're going in for an evaluation or something, and it doesn't work out your way, or something. Retirement, I talked a little bit about that in the last episode. So there's all these experiences of life which really involve, there's a death going on. There's something, a death that I like to say, the death of how we used to be. And we have to come to terms. And the invitation, I think, from sadness is there's an invitation, first of all, to let go. There's something, in each of these experiences, there's things that we can hold on to very closely. And maybe it's an invitation that maybe I just need to let go of that. So say, for example, the loss of promotion. Maybe I had this great image of where my career would go. And all of a sudden it's not working out that. And I'm clinging on to that. And maybe the invitation of this sadness is I need to let go of this and reevaluate where I am in my life. And then the other thing as well is I think sadness brings us into the present moment. There's something beautiful about sadness in the sense of when we're hurt with sadness and loss, we're in that moment. And I think at times we can abide that call to be present. And then also I think it teaches us resilience because as we come out of the sadness, we have all these imaginations about I would never survive that, or I could never deal with this, or I could never go through this experience. And then as we come out of that, boy, I'm stronger than I thought I
Yeah.
was. And boy, I learned a lot of lessons in the midst of that. And that's also something really, about survival, that we actually are stronger than we think we are. What of that resonates with you, Bridget?
Mm, so much of it. I think the invitation around letting go is a powerful one. When we have a loss, it's not just the loss of that thing, that person, that situation, that job. It's a loss of a future that we had imagined.
Mm,
And I think letting go of that can be really painful, but necessary because the only way we can create a new future is to let go of the future that is no longer going to be exactly how we thought, right?
yeah,
That
absolutely.
really rang for me. And then the whole resilience piece. I mean, human beings are just innately resilient. It's baked into our evolutionary DNA. But sometimes we don't really know how strong we are, how capable we are until we face a huge loss. And that can transform us. And it can awaken within us facets of ourselves and capabilities and insights that we were not in touch with. That really spoke to me. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
It really is a gift, isn't it?
It truly is. It truly is when you look at it through that lens. Given that no matter what, we will all go through this experience and in different degrees in our lives. Perhaps some of you listening in are going through an intense moment of sadness. So I'm curious, Bridget, let's turn to offer maybe some tips in how we go through a period of sadness and maybe what we might find helpful as we journey in this experience.
Yeah, I think the very first, most important thing is we have to acknowledge it.
Hmm.
Obviously, right? Like we have to acknowledge our feelings, not bottle them up. And, we've been talking a little bit about sadness in the workplace. I think people feel like if they're going through a profound loss, they have to be totally quiet about it and bottle up while they're at work.
Hmm.
I'm not sure that's the best approach.
No.
We still have to meet our requirements and do our jobs, but it's okay for people to know that we're experiencing sadness and loss. And even as leaders, I think it's important to tell our teams, I'm going through a really difficult time. I don't want you to misinterpret it. I've got some stuff I'm working through. And so it's okay to not be okay. We're not
Yeah.
going to be okay all the time. And we're simply coming to terms with things, right?
Yeah.
I think the second one I would say, and boy, did I learn the value of this recently, is that we have to practice self care when
Mm.
we're going through a period of significant sadness and loss, which I found myself in maybe starting like 4 or 5 months ago. And the only thing that I thought I could do that was in my control to help me deal with it was to exercise like a crazy lady.
Mm.
So I got on the treadmill every morning, and I don't do treadmills, Irvin. So this was kind of unusual behavior, but I just somehow my own body, my wisdom knew you have
Yeah.
to get on that thing and sweat this out every single
Yeah.
day. And that was my lifeline. And then I started doing weights and more things that I hadn't previously been as consistent about. And let me
Mm.
tell you, that made all the difference.
Yeah.
So, whatever self care means, to you, that would be the second tip. I think the third one is, taking that time to find the outlets to express your emotions, the safe havens, whether that's through journaling or whether that's through a trusted friend or whether that's through a walk in nature where you can be present. You said sadness brings us into the present. So can we find people and places and pockets of time to express freely the sadness that is coursing through us? And then the last one, no surprise here, is, reach out to loved ones. This is difficult because for some of us, when we're going through sadness and loss, we withdraw.
Yeah.
So it's not our instinct. Now, my instinct is to reach out when I am, but I don't know if that's your instinct, Irvin.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
Not my
actually,
husband's instinct. He wouldn't do that.
yeah, I tend to withdraw a little bit
Yeah.
in my sadness. Yeah. That my initial reaction. And yet there's nothing more I love than in my sadness when I connect with another person. I come out of that and I'll say to myself, why didn't I call them earlier?
Yeah.
So instinctually there, but that connection is good, but it's not my instinct.
Yes. So to our listeners, it's so important to know what is your instinct and to be mindful of that, right? Because we need that staying connected piece to help us through, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So Irvin, sadness in the workplace. We haven't necessarily touched specifically on that. And so how might we support a colleague, a boss, a peer who might be grieving or just going through a really difficult time with lots of sadness? What do we do with that?
Yeah. So, I just wanted to mention a few things. First of all, in the context, I think we live in a society that is grief phobic or grief illiterate. I think we have these super unrealistic expectations of grief and sadness that in some way a person who's going through loss. Now, there is, of course, the loss of a loved one, which is, people say, oh, that's defined and okay. But it's this go away for a few days and come back after your bereavement leave and you'll be fine. And it's just, that is not how we grieve, because the multiplicity of when people decide to grieve and how they grieve is so different dependent on the human being. It's important to realize no two humans go through grief in the same way.
Mm-hmm.
And for some, it'll start right away. For others, it will be 4 months down the road and all of a sudden it hits them.
Mm-hmm.
We went through the loss of my mother who had dementia. There was a lot of grieving before she had died. And so the impact of that was a little surprising to me. It didn't impact me as much. But then when I thought about it, oh boy, I've been dealing with this for a lot of time. So I think to name that in times we live in a society that doesn't deal with this well.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second thing in the workplace is I think we have to acknowledge that sadness is actually very common in the workplace. And it may not be the death of a loved one, but a performance appraisal, a missed promotion, missed goals or targets that we had set, a loss of a contract, a failure to win a contract. All of
Mm-hmm.
these are experiences that are common in the workplace, and loss is a part of it. Or sadness, you may feel angry about it as well, but there's sadness in there. And to
Mm-hmm.
really recognize that that's part of, I think, is really important. So, specifically when we're dealing with a colleague or who is kind of dealing with sadness, I think one is, coming from this is to give them time and space. So to recognize that not everyone is demanding the same thing, but, kind of just feel them out a little bit and really assess what kind of support do you need?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really important. And I think, very often I think we are tongue tied in what to say. And that can lead to some really trite things. And people have said things to me, which have made me really angry. And I think the best thing we can say to a person is, how can I best support you? And let the person determine what they need at the moment. And I think that's really important. And then I think the second thing is it's not one and done. So, don't be surprised if a few months down the road, you've noticed a person is having a really tough day. And that could just be something has triggered it. I know from my father has a certain candy that they loved. And when I see a picture of that candy, it can trigger something within me, just a
Mm.
memory, and all of a sudden, boom. So don't even think of it one and done. And then the other one is if the workplace allows for flexibility, use that. Allow some accommodation. Maybe a person actually would like some space and time. Maybe they're going into a deadline which is really overwhelming. Is there any flexibility you can offer that person? And just, kind of gauge where they're at and let the person, speak as well for that. I think those are really important. Anything else, Bridget, you would add?
Well, I think be a coach, right? So
Mm,
if the sadness is due to, let's say, they didn't get the promotion they wanted, like you brought up, right?
yeah,
Or they had a less than stellar performance appraisal conversation, which shook them to their core. Or they were so excited about a new project that they were going to participate in, and the client pulled the plug on it. I mean, whatever the case may be, what's becoming so clear to me in this conversation, Irvin, is loss is not only a part of life, but it's a part of our everyday work experiences, right?
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
somebody somewhere in the organization is experiencing sadness due to loss.
yeah,
And so, if this is somebody on our team, we can be a coach to them and create a safe space for them to process
yeah,
the emotion and for them to think through after they process the emotion how they want to move forward and what a gift that can be when we do that for people. You know,
yeah,
I know
yeah,
you've had many conversations with your clients, just as I have, where we wouldn't have called it this, but basically we're helping somebody process a loss and the sadness associated with that.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
So, so Irvin, this is kind of a delicate subject in some regards for people. It certainly has a certain weight and heft to it, this notion of sadness. But yet we still want to leave people with a practice of sorts. What do you have
yeah.
in mind this time?
We've mentioned before, that the invitation, perhaps, of sadness is to come into the present. And the invitation is to think about, what am I letting go? And the invitation perhaps is, where am I moving to? In the busyness of our lives, that can be difficult. I think at times with sadness, we struggle. Where do we enter? For me, poetry has always been a beautiful place that it can express to me perhaps sentiments that I'm struggling to put words on. And I thought, I put this as a suggestion for people, maybe, to find a poem to access maybe the emotion of sadness and to be able to kind of come to present to what we're feeling. So I chose a poem called Breathing Underwater. It was very meaningful for me when I was going through some experiences. And it's a beautiful poem that I really think touches or helps us access what's going on. So let me just read it, and maybe that be our practice today. I built my house by the sea, not on sands, mind you, not on shifting sand. And I built it of rock, a strong house by a strong sea. And we got well acquainted, the sea and I, good neighbors. Not that we spoke much, we met in silences, respectful, keeping our distance, but looking our thoughts across the fence of sand, always the fence of sand or barrier, always the sand between. And then one day, and I still don't know how it happened, the sea came without warning, without welcome even, not sudden and swift, but a shifting across the sand like wine, less like the flow of water than the flow of blood, slow but coming, slow but forming like an open wound. And I thought of flight, and I thought of drowning, and I thought of death. And while I thought the sea crept higher, still it reached my door. I knew then there was neither fight, nor death, nor drowning, that when the sea comes calling, you stop being neighbors, well acquainted, friendly at a distant neighbors, and you give your house for a coral castle, and you learn to breathe underwater.
Ooh, that's beautiful.
Mm.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I love the way, that at times sadness can feel like a wave and the sea coming over you. And you kind of in that midst, you think, oh, I can't breathe in the midst of this. And then all of a sudden, we discover a little resilience and we become acquainted with it, this experience which is out there. And so many, that's what it's about, befriending this experience.
Mm. Wow. Thank you so much for that, Irvin. And to myself and to our listeners, I encourage you to, if you are experiencing sadness and loss, wherever you are, perhaps in this poem, you're in that distant place of keeping that wave at bay. Or perhaps you're in that place where the wave has come over you and you don't think you're going to ever breathe again. Or perhaps you're in that place where you've gone beyond that and you are learning to breathe underwater. It doesn't matter where we are because it is a process. It's just nice to know that part of our humanity is this gift of sadness and loss. And because it's baked into our DNA, what is also baked into our DNA is an internal mechanism for dealing with it. We know in our cells, we know how to do this, but at times it can feel like we're wanting that life preserver and it's nowhere to be found.
Yes. So
So
true.
thank you, Irvin, for a lovely
Oh,
conversation.
thank you too. Yeah.
And to appreciate not only the gift of sadness, but the fact that the workplace was punctuated by
Mm.
sadness and loss. And perhaps some of our listeners have thought, oh, I didn't really realize that before,
Mm.
and how we can be resources to people in this journey. Thank you, Irvin.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Bye, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.